Yeah, it kind of just becomes a numbers game at that point, right? And we know
Right.
there's going to be more help on the way in the back end with the coming years. So that's definitely going to be a situation to keep an eye on throughout the offseason. The last three free agents, restricted free agents, all of them are that I wanted to ask you about, are kind of guys that I think you can throw into the same group as their Austin Wagner, Anders Bjork, and Joey Anderson, all guys that the Blackhawks acquired in the second half of the season. They got a little bit of time, probably, 15, 20 games. Bjork was hurt, same with Wagner when he first arrived, but each kind of showed some intrigue at some point in time there down the stretch of the season. All are restricted free agents, all 26 years old or younger. Do you think the Blackhawks have the means to bring all three of these guys back? Is that what you think the expectation is? Two or the three? What do you think about this group right here?
Yeah, we did a podcast last week of which UFA and RFAs we're going to bring back, and after like re-listening to what some of my answers were, I'm pretty sure I brought back a lot of players for the Blackhawks, and I left no room for them to sign free agents. So I'm like, I wish I could have a couple answers back. Joey Anderson to me is the interesting candidate because if Boris Kachuk is back and Jujhar Khaira is back, I guess those are big ifs for Jujar. Which, by the way, I don't know if you saw this, but
Bring
Jujhar
everyone
Khaira,
back. Just bring them all back.
yeah,
Run it
just
back.
just roll back the whole roster. No roster decisions.
Ian
I
Mitchell.
noticed.
Mitchell's gone.
Yeah, exactly. He's the one guy. He's the one guy. I saw that on Instagram that Jujhar Khaira posted just like a picture of him, and he said "Thank you, Chicago," and that felt to me like a goodbye. I don't know if the Blackhawks told him during the exit meetings that they're not bringing him back, but so it feels like he's not going to be back, which is interesting because he was one of the three players that was part of one of the most effective lines by Chicago down the stretch with Kachuk and Anderson. So I think Bjork, he showed flashes in that small sample size, and then he got hurt, which was really unfortunate because I wish we would have been able to see a larger sample size down the stretch to be like, okay, this we can build on this, or maybe we should just let him go, right? So that one's up in the air. Wagner, I feel like I don't know. He does fit what the Blackhawks mold is, speed player. Like somebody told me, who was it? The last week of the season, somebody said like Austin Wagner is like one of the fastest skaters in the NHL, and I was like, what? Austin Wagner? I like obviously you don't know as much about Austin Wagner, so I'm like, okay, well that sounds like a player the Blackhawks would want to keep around, right? So, but at the same time, he would probably be more of like a 13th forward, just like a rotational player. And then Joey Anderson, I would bring back just because of what he brings to the table. Like he can play in the middle six. He's likely a bottom. He's likely a fourth line guy, just moving forward. But he can maybe bounce around and bring that physicality a little bit, while also adding some scoring touch, if you will, like maybe 10 to 15 goals a season max. But yeah, they have some decisions to make, and they're not going to bring back everyone. But I could see a case for them to bring back more people than I originally thought. Right? It's weird.
Yeah, I'm on the fence about a lot of the same guys too. It's like, well, I could build a scenario for either end of the spectrum here. So yeah, the Blackhawks, while we don't expect them to be very active in terms of going out and adding people, I'm really interested to see who and why they choose to bring back some of these guys to see how their roster builds out these next few years. But the man that's in control of their roster, well, I guess not technically in control. He's not the general manager, but the head coach making decisions as to which one of these guys is going to be in the lineup, of course, is Luke Richardson. We kind of have been talking about prospects and the future of the Blackhawks, but I do want to ask you about your thoughts on Luke Richardson as a whole in his first year as the Blackhawks head coach. Obviously, I don't think anyone's going to be holding the wins and losses above his head, right? Like, not going to be completely on his end. Sure, there's going to be a time where he has to prove he has to win as a head coach, but that's obviously not right now. And I was far more impressed with the effort level that we saw out of the Blackhawks basically all year long, particularly at the end of the season when the roster was very dicey. It was very noticeable, especially in comparison to what we had seen out of this team the last couple of years. So to me, while the Blackhawks obviously didn't win many games this year, I was still left with a very positive impression of Luke Richardson. We also heard only good things off of the ice as well. So I gave him 2 thumbs up for his first year as Blackhawks head coach. What did you think all in all about his first year behind the bench?
Yeah, I'd agree. It's so weird because if you're someone that did not watch Blackhawks hockey at all this year, like outside of Chicago, if you're just a generic fan of Carolina or the Rangers or whatever, you just didn't watch the Blackhawks this year, it's easy to go look at the win-loss record. It's easy to go look at the goal differential and look at the expected 5-on-5 numbers and be like, the Blackhawks were last, they're their third worst or their second worst, right? And be like, I don't know if Luke Richardson did a great job, but it was the way the Blackhawks lost their games were so different from the way Anaheim and Columbus lost their games this year, right? How many times did the Blackhawks lose a 1-goal game, or they rallied from a multi-goal deficit? What was it? I think they led the league in multi-goal comeback victories this year, which one, I guess you could say they found themselves trailing in a lot of games, but it goes to show you how much that they put up a fight. I feel like in years past or the last few years, the Blackhawks found themselves down 3-0 or 4-0 in the first period, and it was like that was it. Like the game was just over, right? That wasn't the case with Luke Richardson. And the amount of times I went home from a Blackhawks game and fired up the Anaheim Ducks game just to see what it's like. Second period, the score is like 5-1. They're losing. It's like, man, they're not even competitive. It was just so different from the way the Blackhawks were losing, like tight games. They were in almost, I would say they were in like 80% of the games. They either won or they lost close, right? And I think that's the foundation that Luke Richardson wanted to lay. And I think that's the foundation that Kyle Davidson hoped that Luke Richardson would lay when he got hired. So that is a really positive first step. And it's weird that we're both giving Luke Richardson a 2 thumbs up for finishing third worst and having a terrible goal differential for the Blackhawks this year. But he was a really solid coach for Chicago this year, and to really lay the first step of that groundwork for the rebuild.
Yeah, it was kind of in terms of stuff on the ice that there were moments where it's hard to exactly gauge how well he was doing as a head coach, but seeing the team's never say die type of attitude. And then I think just even the most impressive part to me was look at that roster down the stretch. I mean,
Yeah.
I'd tweet out the lines and I'd be getting quote tweets. I remember from Penguins fans like, if we lose to this team, which of course they but just the fact
Well,
that
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
yeah,
I covered the New York Rangers Patrick Kane's first game in New York, which was right after the deadline, right, or right before the deadline, right? I came back to Chicago, so I missed that game, the Blackhawks at Dallas game, or the Dallas game right before the trade deadline. My first game back to cover the Blackhawks, I was watching practice, and I'm like, I literally don't know who some of these guys are right now. Like I needed to look at, I didn't even know the numbers. Like it was so weird. So yeah, I agree. Like what Luke Richardson did with the roster post trade deadline was fascinating.
yeah, I think you have to give him credit, right? And just the way that they were playing, like you mentioned, they were in a lot of close games. They had a lot of like truthfully like beautiful tank losses where it was 2-2, 1-1 until
Yeah.
4 minutes left. And then, the team scores to go ahead and they add an empty netter. And on paper, it looks like a 3-1 loss, but there were still a lot of positives to take away. And I think that's kind of a synopsis as a whole is that there's a lot to build on from Luke Richardson's first year as the Blackhawks head coach, or did a really good job in the second half of the season post trade deadline. And Charlie, I mentioned when we first opened the show, I did want to talk to you about the Blackhawks and the moves that they made at the trade deadline this year, since you were last on just prior to that. Obviously, Patrick Kane gets traded. The whole world knows about that. Jake McCabe and Sam Lafferty get packaged to go to Toronto together. The Hawks get a first, a second, and Joey Anderson as part of that deal. Max Domi goes to Dallas for a second. What do you think, all in all, about Kyle Davidson's deadline? I forgot that we got a free second and a fourth for Nikita Zaitsev as well, who, to be fair, that's probably what you need to give someone to take him, because he did not look good at the end of the season. I don't know if that was just my opinion, but it wasn't a good start to his Blackhawks tenure. Maybe the end of it, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. By the way, the fact that the Blackhawks got a second round pick, so I guess 2 second round picks for Nikita Zaitsev and Riley Stillman earlier this year, and Jason Dickinson, like to get, I mean, those were 2 really, really solid trades for Kyle Davidson. So shout out to him for that. As far as the rest of the trade deadline moves, I think Could they have gotten more for Patrick Kane? Probably. The only reason that they didn't is because St. Louis or New York went to St. Louis.
St. Louis always ruins everything. Everything.
They always ruin everything. They're always in the thorn in the side. The Rangers moved on from Patrick Kane, and they're like, we're turning our attention to Vladimir Tarasenko and Nico Mikkola because they felt like Kane. They didn't want to wait around for Kane's decision, but they also had concerns about his injury, right? I think if the New York Rangers prioritize Patrick Kane, the return that the New York Rangers got for Tarasenko, or the St. Louis got for Tarasenko and Mikkola, is probably the return that Chicago would have gotten for Patrick Kane. But because Kane made the decision late, and the Rangers basically spent their draft capital, they're like, we don't need Kane, but if he desperately wants to come here, we'll move mountains to make it work. And Kyle Davidson had zero leverage. So, it was hard for him to really. I think if the Rangers get by New Jersey and they end up going to the Eastern Conference Final, which looks like a pretty decent possibility if they can get by New Jersey, because if Carolina is going to be the team waiting on the other end, they're not going to be able to score the way the Rangers score, especially without Pacioretty, Svechnikov, all the injuries that they've endured during Teravainen, obviously. So it's going to be difficult. But I think all in all, Kyle Davidson, the one thing that I found was noteworthy in his exit interview, I asked him specifically what he thought he learned his first full year as a GM this year. And the one thing he said is, I can't control some of the things that I would like to control. And one of those things are how I view a player versus how another team views a player. So maybe internally the Blackhawks are like, Patrick Kane is still that 100-point player, but his production is low because he's playing with not Alex DeBrincat anymore, right? You can't sell that to the other team. Like, the other team needs to see that. Or his injury is not as bad as it was last year. It's probably the same, right? But you can't sell that to the team. So I think Davidson did as best as he could with the market value, or I guess with what the market was dictating. Whether he got the correct draft picks or whatever in return, it could be debated, but it's not like he didn't try to maximize his value, right? So it was a tricky situation for him with the Kane one specifically.
Yeah, considering the situation, I think the best he was going to do when you have absolute leverage, all the cards are out there on the table, and New York knows what's going on here. Probably even fortunate that they have an opportunity to get another first-round pick. Hopefully the Rangers will be able to solve the puzzle that has been Akira Schmid in Games 3 and at Madison Square Garden. I didn't know what the heck was going on. I saw Schmid was announced as the starter for Game 3, 22-year-old kid who has 9 NHL starts under his belt, threw a nice wager on the Rangers and ended up looking like a fool. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there the rest of that series. Us Blackhawks fans obviously will be watching with a close eye there. But before we move on from the trade deadline, were you a little bit confused like I was as to how the Blackhawks took on Anton Khudobin and still only got a second for Max Domi? I mean, I'm happy with a second for Max Domi. And if you told me that at the beginning of the season, that when we signed Max Domi, we were going to flip him at the deadline for a second-round pick, I would have been happy. And I'm still happy about it. I think it was a fine trade, but I would have just figured taking on a bad contract like Khudobin's to help out a playoff caliber team like the Dallas Stars, they could have gotten a little bit more. Did you think the same thing, or did you think this was actually just about right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I got to go back and look at it to see what Dallas's cap situation was like at the time, but it didn't feel like, because I had that original reaction. I'm like, what? Only a second-round pick? The Chicago took on the bad contract too. I don't know if Dallas was as desperate to move the contract as much as, like, I don't think they needed to move the contract to make the Domi trade work, right? I could be mistaken, but so it felt like the Blackhawks were maybe, what if the original offer was a third-round pick for Domi, and the Blackhawks were like, no, we're not doing that. And then they're like, all right, we'll give you a second, and we'll throw in Khudobin, right? So maybe that was the scenario. I can't remember off the top of my head what Dallas's financial situation was, but Again, I also think Max Domi, I think the league knows what he is at this point. So even though he was setting a career, you know, putting up really strong offensive numbers, I think the one thing that was a little surprising is they didn't get a more for Domi. Like, not that they didn't get a first round pick for Domi, but maybe it was like a second and a third, right? Or like something like that. Is he was like among the face-off leaders in the NHL, right? And I thought maybe that would have been pretty valuable, but Dallas is one of the best face-off teams in the league, so they're probably like, we don't really need him for that. It would have been different if maybe a team that was really struggling in the face-off department saw value in Domi at the face-off circle, that they felt like, okay, we'll pay the extra premium just to make sure that we get this guy because he might take our defensive zone draws. But so yeah, that was my feeling on it. Could they have gotten more? Maybe if they would have sold him sooner, but it felt like the reason they couldn't sell him sooner is because other teams had bigger priorities, right? He was kind of just like the fallback.
Yeah, good points you bring up. At the end of the day, getting a second for Max Domi, I don't think anyone's going to complain about that. But speaking of Domi, speaking of Patrick Kane, how about these Stanley Cup playoffs, Charlie? Just marvelous as always. Lots of good battles. I'm excited to tune in tonight once we hop off the podcast. But I did want to ask you, I think, did you have Toronto winning it all? Because you're a
Yeah, I do.
If you do.
I do. Jack, I got crucified on our last podcast that we recorded on Tuesday. I think Pat was he was very adamant. He's like, Boston is they're gonna steamroll Toronto in the second round. And I'm just like, no. Toronto is better than they are showing in the first round. I think they're just trying to get over a mental hurdle. Listen, I had Toronto from the beginning of the season, like they would win the Stanley Cup. I'm still sticking with it, but I'm not confident because they got to go through Boston, right? That's a really tough. I didn't think Boston would have a historically good year, right? So I think that obviously makes me a little concerned, but I do think they're going to make that Boston series very interesting. It is going to go at least 6, maybe 7, and the Toronto's going to play better in that series than they have. By the way, I'm assuming that Toronto's going to get the job done.
Just about to say.
I'm pretty confident that they will, but it's when they do, I'll just say that when they do.
Plus 750. I already know the line. Plus 750 for the Tampa Bay Lightning to win this series, by the way.
Really? Okay. I think it's Toronto's. They're going to get, I think they're like, my prediction is they're going to get it done in Toronto on Thursday. They're going to end it. Don't get cute. Just find a way to win the game, move on, exercise the demons. Then I think they'll play a lot freer and they'll play like the team that they have been playing all year, like the team they've been playing all year long, and not be overthinking as much. So we'll see if that happens. But yes, I am fully on the Toronto Maple Leafs bandwagon.
Your bold move, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for them.
Probably dumb.
We'll see. That's what we love about the Stanley Cup playoffs. But I was going to ask you, knowing what we do now, I love that you're riding or dying with the Maple Leafs train here. But other than the Leafs, who have you been impressed by, or maybe if there was anything you could change about your bracket, even on the Western Conference side, what would that be at this point based on what we've seen through the first week and a half of the Stanley Cup playoffs?
Yeah, so my preseason pick was Maple Leafs over Oilers in the Stanley Cup final. I feel really good about how well Edmonton is playing, but I was so nervous about that first round matchup, and to the point where, like I said on record, I'm like, if LA wins this series, they're going to win the West. Like that's how good they are, and they don't get credit for that because they were actually a little bit better in a lot of the underlying metrics in the second half of the season than Edmonton was, right? So my prediction is the winner of that series wins the West. So if I were to tweak my bracket, I guess I would say if Edmonton finds a way to lose this first round series, I would swap my bracket and say LA is going to win the West and not Edmonton. But I'm obviously going to stick with Edmonton because that was my original pick.
I have Edmonton going to the Stanley Cup as well, and I'll tell you what. I believe in Connor McDavid, and I believe in Leon Draisaitl. But having Stuart Skinner in net and saying you're going to go to the Stanley Cup, it feels bold. And we know at this point, watching hockey for a long time, you need to have a goalie to be able to win the Stanley Cup. And it feels like, God, Stuart Skinner, is he really the guy for the Oilers? But they feel like they're finally getting it clicking. Leon Draisaitl has been rolling so far. Connor McDavid with a big night last night. It's going to be an interesting Stanley Cup playoffs, as it always is. But I did want to ask you, too, about Patrick Kane. I got a couple more questions for you. I know we've been rolling for 40 minutes here. I apologize.
You're good. No, don't apologize.
Appreciate it. I did want to ask you, obviously, I'm sure some of it relies on what goes on throughout these Stanley Cup playoffs, but I am interested to pick your brain about what you think Patrick Kane is considering now that he's going to be obviously an unrestricted free agent at the end of the season. He only gave the Blackhawks the Rangers to work with. Obviously, it came down to the dying days, but do you feel like he got traded to the Rangers or wanted to go there because that was a good chance for him to sign an extension there? Or do you think he's wanting to go into free agency with, the best possible scenario for him? Do you think he's leaning New York? If you had to guess, what do you think's going through Kaner's mind at this point? It's a very unfamiliar situation for him.
Yeah, so first off, if you're a Blackhawks fan listening, I would cross off him potentially re-signing with Chicago. That's not going to happen. I do think in Patrick Kane's mind, he would love to re-sign with the Rangers. And we all know they're a really good team. They got a really good young core. I guess I shouldn't say young, but they got Shesterkin, Fox. They got just a really strong core. I think the one thing that also is very appealing to him is how easy it is for his family to catch his games, right? I don't know how much this is documented, but Patrick Kane's dad does not like to fly. So he drives to and from Buffalo. Like when Patrick Kane was in Chicago, like he would drive to and from Buffalo, which is an 8-hour drive to watch Patrick Kane's games, right? And obviously he would stick around to, if the Blackhawks had a homestand, he'd stick around for the whole homestand. But I think he likes the idea that his family can be able to watch him at any time, right? So I think that is a big priority for him. He wants that sort of stability where I'm playing on a good team, I'm playing with good players, I have a chance to win a Stanley Cup, but this is also a convenient situation for me and my family. I think he wants to check all of those boxes. So if it was up to him, I'm sure he would like to re-sign with the Rangers. I'm just not sure the Rangers have it in their budget to do so. So Kane would have to take a fairly significant discount to want to re-sign with the Rangers and make it convenient for him to stay there.
Last question I got for you, Charlie. Obviously, we saw Jonathan Toews play in his final game as a member of the Chicago Blackhawks. Pretty emotional night at the United Center, of course. And I've been asked by a lot of people whether or not I think Jonathan Toews is coming back, if he's going to retire. And I don't mean to just put you on the spot here, but if he does come back, I think it's such an intriguing situation for him to come back to, right? Because he was obviously just making $10.5 million. We all know he's not going to be getting anything close to that if he does want to return. And I think that creates such an intriguing spot for him on the market compared to like where he'd want to go and who would be interested in him. Again, not to put you on the spot, but if you had to lean one way or another, you think Toews is going to be back in the NHL next year? And like, where do you think would be possibly a good fit?
I would be very, very surprised if he played. I think like to me, in his post-game press conference in that last game, it felt like a guy that was leaning towards retirement. Not just leaning, that was like seriously considering. I mean, he was talking about, yeah, it'd be nice to do this. It'd be nice to have free time for that. I mean, you don't go into that depth if you haven't given it some serious thought. But here's the thing that is the tipping point for me. Do you remember Patrick Sharp's last game at the United Center with the Blackhawks, where he came out with the A when he wasn't an alternate captain that year because he came back from Dallas, and he wasn't playing a ton of minutes in that last season with Chicago. But that last home game that he played, the Blackhawks threw him out there a ton. Like I think he averaged like 12 minutes of ice time during that season. And in that last game at the United Center, he played I think he played close to 20 minutes. Jonathan Toews' last game, if you remember, Luke Richardson said before the game, he was asked, how much are you going to play Jonathan Toews tonight? And he's like, as much as possible. And that game went into overtime. It almost went into a shootout, and Toews barely got over 16 minutes of ice time. And I don't think that was because Luke Richardson didn't want to play him as much, or like didn't have the opportunity to play him. I think that's what Jonathan Toews was able to give him, right? So if Jonathan Toews is going to return, he's probably going to be in a third line role for another team, and he's not going to be the player that he thinks he can be. And so I think that would be a difficult hurdle for him to overcome, to want to go to a different situation, a totally different. It's different when like Patrick Kane's playing on the first line for the New York Rangers right now. You know, like he's tasting those minutes. Jonathan Toews is probably not going to get that. So you would have to sacrifice that possibility to want to return. I just don't see it happening. So I would be very surprised if he continued playing beyond this year. I think we've seen his last game.
I'm kind of in agreement as well. Just hearing that presser too, and hearing, like you said, like him talking about like, oh, it would be nice to kind of do some of those things that I
Yeah.
back burner. Like, sounds like he really is strongly considering that, as sad as it may be, that it's the end of what a run from Jonathan Toews, what a run it was here in Chicago, and pretty awesome that he, you know, I wish he scored the overtime winner, but cool regardless that he found a way to wind up scoring a goal in his final game with the Blackhawks. So we'll keep an eye out.
The real question is, Jack, let's just say hypothetically Jonathan Toews has played his last game. Do you retire Jonathan Toews' number as soon as next season? But I feel like you got to retire Duncan Keith's number because his contract expires this summer, right? Well, yeah. Technically. So like, do you retire two numbers in the same year, or do you space it out? I don't know. This is a good problem to have, though, if you're the Blackhawks, right?
I was just about to say, what a luxury we had of having all those superstars and future Hall of Famers on the roster at one time. I'm looking forward to those nights, though, because one of the best nights of the entire year was Marian Hossa's retirement. I mean, I was wondering who had the onions in the crowd when I was sitting up in the stands. But yeah, it's going to be cool to have more moments like that. We'll see when that day ends up coming. No doubt that it will be sometime soon down the road for Jonathan Toews. But Charlie, I've taken up enough of your time, man. I appreciate you coming on and having this lengthy talk with me. As always, lots of fun, brother. And looking forward to all the Blackhawks content that you put out over the summer. Hopefully not too much, though, because I know you're a man during the season, and this is the time of the year where we can kind of put our feet up and relax. So looking forward to everything you provide for the Blackhawks, Charlie, and thank you again for coming on, dude.
Thanks, man. No apologies necessary. I can talk hockey all day with you. So it was fun to do it. And I'm sure we'll do it again post draft when we can have some optimism or have some positivity to look forward to.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it, Charlie. So once again, thank you, man. And thank you to everyone out there for listening to the show. Just a reminder again, you could follow Locked On Blackhawks for free wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe on YouTube. Make sure to do that real quick so you can get all of the latest episodes as soon as they come out each and every day.